Without much ado, I would like to now present our next speaker. So this is Dr. J. Picardal, who is currently a researcher of the Research Institute of Tropical Biology and Pharmacological Biotechnology. And also he's in Cebu Normal University in Cebu City. He completed his PhD in biology from De La Salle University in Manila in 2017. He focused on the systematics, ecology, and ethnobotany of Philippine cinnamon under the supervision of Dr. Neil Aldrin Malyari, president of the Center for Conservation Innovations of the Philippines. His current research interests include, firstly, the understanding of use and value of Philippine spices, the ethnopharmacology of wild edible plants, and urban biodiversity conservation. So together with other Filipino botanists from De La Salle University and Cebu Normal University, his most recent work is in collaboration with the Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid, Spain, where he led a book chapter entitled Philippine Plants in the Last 500 Years, perfect for 2021, so hopefully in the post-COVID era. Ethnobotany and Socio-Cultural Significance in time for the quinticentennial celebration of the first circumnavigation of the world. So I would like to welcome Dr. J. Picardal to speak to us about his work.
Thank you, Dr. Yob, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Very clearly, yes, to me.
Okay.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues, friends, my former students, and my professors also who are listening and attending this webinar. So today I'll be talking about Today, I'll be talking about habitat preferences, endemicity, and proposed conservation status of Cinnamonum in the Philippines. Together with me is my advisor, Dr. Malyari. So the outline of the presentation, I'll start talking about the Philippine cinnamon, the morphological features, brief history, taxonomic problems, and then this will be followed by habitat preferences and endemicity based on herbarium records and species distribution modeling. And then finally, I'll end my presentation in proposing conservation status and threats to cinnamon diversity. Okay, so in the last 5 years, we've been talking to people, not only academics, but also laymen about the Philippine cinnamon. So how much do they know about our cinnamon in the Philippines? So unfortunately, it is quite sad that only like 7 or 8 students or 7 people that we ask are not actually aware about the Philippine cinnamon, that we have cinnamon in the Philippines. So this kind of reality is actually enough to, it's actually sufficient to justify that truly there is really a need to pursue this, the understanding of Philippine cinnamon, not only in its taxonomic aspect, but also conservation value, utilization, ecology, and others. So cinnamon has approximately 250 species across Asia, South America, and Australia. And in the Philippines, you have 21 species according to Customs in 1986. So basically, when you look at cinnamon trees, you will see the most distinguishing characteristics being the tri-nerved leaves. So if you would notice in this screen, you would actually see these 3 parallel venation here in the leaf. This is one of the most distinguishing characteristics of cinnamon leaves. It also possesses paniculate inflorescences, flowered with 9 stamens, and fruits seated in a copule. So this is what we usually use in characterizing cinnamon species. So basically, we focus on the leaves, of course. And these are the different leaf forms, and then the different inflorescence type, and then the different fruit shapes. as well as the shape of the cupula, which is a very important distinguishing characteristics of cinnamon. This is an illustration from the study of Saw in 2011, and in my own study, I also prepared similar illustration for the Philippines, but it is not yet published at the moment. So before we proceed to the first objective of the study, allow me first to tell you what have happened in the last 500 years, for example, on Philippine cinnamon. So a lot of people are not aware that the spice trade, which was actually started by the Europeans, is anchored in the idea that they are in search of the spices, particularly in the East Indies, where nutmeg, cloves, for example, as well as cinnamon, pepper are actually found. So from 1492 to 1800s, there has been a series of events in the Philippine history in which cinnamon has been discussed and highlighted, not only in terms of propagation, but also in terms of exploitation of this resource. So, however, the most important thing to ask here now is that what made cinnamon taxonomy difficult to study? Why do we really need to study the Philippine cinnamon? At the moment, there is a kind of understanding about people, for example, being confused about the appearance of cinnamon based on leaf characteristics. So the problem on heterophyly and heteroblast is actually very evident. For example, in the case of heterophyly, different leaf forms on the same plant are observed. For example, in this example, there are actually acuminate leaves, and then you also have ovate leaves, and it's actually in the same twig. Meanwhile, heteroblast is another problem in which different development of distinct types of juvenile and of adult foliage shows different shapes. So if parotaxonomists and taxonomists are actually depending only on the leaf structures, this becomes problematic. Another problem is on the presence of intermediate forms, as well as interspecific similarity and the presence of synonymous species. Also on the aspect of whether a kind of sample is a subspecies or is it actually a cultivar or another congener, for example. So in this illustration, you would see, for instance, that this is actually a type specimen in which Burmanii or Mindanaense is actually being proposed as the name of this specimen. On the right side of the illustration is actually like whether it's Mercadoi or Utili. And taxonomists who studied cinnamon are actually changing their identification of these plants for a particular reason based on morphological characteristics. By the way, in the next slides, I'm showing the different cinnamon species that we have in the Philippines based on their type specimen. For example, there's rupestre, nanophyllum, Cinnamonum mercadoi, Ibaloy, which until these days doesn't produce fruits yet. You also have Trichophyllum, Anacardium, and then the famous Cinnamonum cebuense of Cebu. Okay, in the last 200 years or so, scientists and historians have studied cinnamon, and it's actually written in the book of Manuel Blanco, Elmer, Merrill, as well as Santos in 1930, in which he also studied leaf allometry. In this case, even in the 1930s, the idea about the confusing leaf morphology of cinnamon is already apparent and understood. For example, you will see here the different leaf shape of cinnamon species in the Philippines. This is Zelanicum, Mindanaense, Mercadoi, and Iners. So with this conflicting ideas and differences, as well as taxonomic problems on the identification, Andrew Kosterman, so he's actually an Indonesian botanist, created a monograph of the Philippine cinnamon in 1986 to aid in the identification as well as in the understanding of the genus by taxonomists as well as botanists. So aside from that, we also have here recent, what they call this one, effort to understand the use, understand taxonomy of cinnamon based on chemosystematics or chemical constituents as proposed by researchers from De La Salle University, in which they compared, for example, the different chemical constituents found in these 7 Cinnamonum species. In UP Los Baños, some researchers utilized phenotypic markers like leaf architecture from the research group of Dr. Buot to infer variation, to infer and understand Cinnamonum taxonomy based on morphological characteristics on the leaf architecture. In Cebu Normal University, my students also underwent research study in which they also investigated a specific species, the Cinnamonum indonense, and that despite the differences in the leaf shape, they actually possess a common characteristic, which is the presence of secondary veins that is running diagonal to the primary vein. In the recent years, there has also been a lot of effort for the conservation of cinnamon. So it all started in 1998 with the funding given to Mindanao, and then followed by the NUCA project through the ENR. You also have here the Global Trees Campaign, the Flagship Species Fund from the Flora and Fauna International, the PBSP, focusing on the planting of Cinnamonum cebuense, and then most recently, a project funded by the PTFCF entitled the Pinoy Cinnamon Conservation Project, which started in 2015 and ended in 2018. Most interestingly, the investigation on Cinnamonum utilization was actually undertaken by business people led by Home Organic Philippines Plantsville Health in Western Visayas, in which they actually started to produce products out of cinnamon, which is actually a very important step towards making cinnamon known to Filipinos and telling Filipinos about its use and value. So with all these studies, as well as knowledge about the Philippine cinnamon, I was able to figure knowledge gaps which needs to be studied. And one of these is actually habitat suitability and ecological range, among others. So today, my focus is actually to briefly tell the output or the findings of my research on ecology and conservation status, in which I ask the question, where can we find cinnamon in the Philippines? And can we possibly predict habitats where cinnamon would grow best in the future? As well as on its conservation status, whether the conservation status is actually updated, or is there a need to propose a new conservation status for the Philippine cinnamon? So to be able to answer this question, I utilized species distribution modeling, which is actually a tool that uses computer algorithm like maximum entropy to be able to utilize biophysical and bioclimatic data and utilize this with the occurrence records and interpolate species distribution over a particular geographical area, as well as predict where they would be found in the future. So in my study, we actually employed different environmental layers, as you will see in the screen, and like biophysical variables as well as bioclimatic variables. So all of these are actually available from computer databases. And we utilize this together with quantum GIS to be able to identify areas with high concentration of species. So this flow chart would tell us about how we make use of this world climb databases, as well as occurrence records found in herbarium records, as well as our current initiative to look for cinnamon species in all over the country, and merge all of this together to be able to look to create a map that would actually show policymakers as well as conservation groups where can we possibly find cinnamon in the future, as well as plant them. So briefly, I'm going to share the methods that we employed in pursuing this study. We actually utilized georeferencing method through this methodology adapted from Ramos et al. In 2012, in which we also employ the Philippine Gazetteer, Google Earth Pro version 7, Picardal and Philippine GIS data to be able to make sure that our occurrence records are actually correct. Because if you would notice, before the Second World War, some botanists would actually just write the name of the mountain, for example, as well as the location in which they collected a particular plant without putting GPS coordinates, which is very problematic if we're going to use this data in modeling. So from this archaic data, as well as the present occurrence records, we inputted them into quantum GIS and Maxent to be able to create this particular map of the distribution, for example, of this species. So another thing that I did on this particular part of my dissertation is that I also reviewed the current conservation status of Philippine cinnamon. And I'm actually happy that with the 5 criteria that are being utilized in the IUCN red listing, at least one is feasible to be generated through SDM. So as long as I have the extent of occurrence, I would be able to at least propose a conservation. The IUCN red list status for a particular species, because recently there has been few effort to investigate the current status of this species based on their number, etc. So this is actually the steps that I did for the computation of extent of occurrence until such time that I was able to generate this data, which I actually use for proposing the conservation status. So these were the findings of my study. First and foremost, you would see actually this habitat suitability map, and then you would see on the left side panel the species richness, in which you would see, for example, in the map that the darker section of the map, or the darker regions in the Philippines, would mean that there are actually a lot of species that has been reported or recorded. For example, in this case, you have plenty of occurrence records from Cebu, Bohol, Mindoro, Palawan, as well as in Luzon. We also found that from the different records that we have, the most favorable, the most favorable habitat is actually located in low elevation areas, in which majority of the cinnamon species are found. For example, from elevation 0 to 400 meters above sea level. If you would notice here, it's also quite interesting that Cinnamomum mendelense was actually found in this particular elevation in Mount Apo, sometime in the early 1900s. We also found that among the 26 environmental variables, the 3 most important that determines or that predicts potential distribution and habitat suitability of the species is, it includes soil type, land cover, and isothermality. Isothermality is actually temperature evenness throughout the year. That's related actually to temperature. So essentially, these 3 variables would determine whether the species of cinnamon would thrive or not. So I'm going to show four examples of maps. These are actually habitat suitability maps, and you would see that the pink dots here are actually the actual occurrence records, and then the colored section of the maps would show the habitat suitability here as indicated by the legend on the left. So you would actually see that even if the occurrence record was reported somewhere else, like for example here, in somewhere in Laguna, a possibility that the species anacardium would also be found somewhere on the northernmost part of the Philippines. It's actually interesting for future conservation planning, in which researchers, for example, can figure out whether truly this species would grow in this particular part of the map. Also, in the case of Cinnamonum cebuense, this is actually a narrow endemic species in Cebu. That's why it's called cebuense, but according to habitat suitability maps, it might thrive somewhere in southern Leyte as well as in Bohol, which is actually quite interesting. And this is generally affected by land cover as well as type of soil as well as aspect. I mean, these parameters contribute much to the suitability of the habitat. Interestingly, Cinnamonum mercadoi, the most widespread species in the Philippines and most collected in the Philippines, also found in a lot of areas. So all of these colored sections of the maps are worth investigating in the future. Okay, so we'll proceed now to the distribution, habitat preferences, and conservation status of cinnamon in the Philippines. So this table is an output of my research, in which if you would notice here, for example, the first column are actually the species, and then the second column is divided into two. This is based on herbarium records, the actual records in herbarium specimen, and this is based on SDM predicted models, the habitat stability model that I just discussed a while ago. And then this column shows the habitat preferences of this particular species, the elevation where they are found, the population trend, whether they are widespread. NA, it means this was not run in the model because the occurrence record is less than 5. So maximum entropy will not actually process occurrence records less than that number. Types of species were generalist and specialist species based on niche position and width. And then these are the current records that we have. So we have DNR admin order. Yes, actually, there's a latest in 2017, so I have to update this. And then IUCN red list status, and then this is my proposed conservation status based on IUCN criteria. So if you would notice, for example, let's take one example here. You would see, for example, that in Cinnamonum Mindanao, there's actually not consistent in terms of in terms of the conservation. The threatened status. Here, for example, I figure out that Mindanao is actually endangered. And meanwhile, Loher is actually data deficient. That's why probably it's not assessed. Something like that. Okay, so basically, most interestingly in this table, the habitat preferences would also guide conservation planners to decide where to possibly invest their money in terms of planting this species. So for those who are interested to know per species, I can actually share my data in the future. So this is actually the output of my research. And also worth noting is the Cinnamonum cebuense, which is actually an island endemic in Cebu. If you would see here, this is based on SDA predicted models, and Cinnamonum cebuensis is likely to be found in northern Cebu, Bohol, southern Leyte, and Biliran Islands. And if you would notice here, it's actually downlisted from critically endangered to become endangered because recently there has been a lot of effort to locate them and find mature trees of this species. Okay, so in summary, this is actually my proposed conservation status of the different Cinnamonum species, and my base is actually the extent of occurrence. So at the moment, there is no critically endangered species. So that's actually quite good news for conservation planners. So some of the pictures here are actually showing some of the threats to Cinnamonum conservation in the Philippines, because recently there has been increased utilization and exploitation of this species. In fact, this is quite expensive compared to our common laurel leaves. Like for example, in Cebu, the trade is not reported, not actually documented rather, in terms of how much has been harvested and how much recovery does a particular plant needs to recover to be able to replace the lost leaves through coppicing. Another one is actually, of course, the typical Sweden agriculture in areas formerly occupied by cinnamon. Okay, so before I end my presentation, allow me to share to you that the conclusion of this portion of my research goes like this. So I realized, and based on the results of my study, this research may have implication in the resilience of cinnamon species against drought. That is, they may survive in thin soil over dry limestone substrate and anthropogenic disturbances, owing to the fact that many species were predicted to occur in built-up areas planted with perennial or annual crops. Further, the scenarios that I presented a while ago may pose a beneficial impact to the adaptation of widespread generalist cinnamon species, as all economically important crops in the tropics face the threat of climate change and human-induced perturbations. Moreover, my research suggests that botanical exploration should be intensified to revisit provenances of specialist species, such that corresponding mitigation measures could be afforded to save the last remaining germplasms in an appropriate conservation program. As humans continue to invade the forest for a safer, cleaner habitat, and as development in the countryside attempt to hasten land use conversions, the actual portion of suitable habitats previously predicted by SDM model for generalist and specialist species will both reduce and has such a corresponding implication to cinnamon conservation in the future. To better produce a more robust prediction and draw holistic conclusion on the ecology and the future habitat suitability of Philippine cinnamon under a changing climate, we need to collect more data on occurrences of cinnamon species and improve database of occurrence records accessible to all. This will facilitate a more accurate prediction of future habitat suitabilities that could be used to enhance policies and conservation directions for these species. For future researches on species distribution modeling and predicting habitat suitability of endemic trees, it is recommended to test more hypotheses associated to the shifting of geographic distributions and habitat suitability under a defined conditions of climate change. Such climatic scenarios will define further the extent of niche differentiation of currently studied cinnamon and could be used by conservation managers to ensure that these suitable habitats could actually be occupied by the species and prevent further loss in the future. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you so much, Dr. J. Picardal, for that very, very informative talk on cinnamon. Meron akong alam na joke about cinnamon. Kasi sabi nila, cinnamon daw is the most selfless plant. Alam niyo ba, sir, kung bakit?
Bakit, ma'am?
Kasi daw walang cinnamon ang nabubuhay para sa sarili.
Sarili
lang.
lang.
Joke nila. Oo. Anyway, that's a really great talk because I think we all really need to know more about the conservation status of these plants that we have para naman alam natin how to take care of them and to preserve them and to maintain its sustainability in the future. So later on, we'll have the question and answer session for Dr. J and Dr. Demi Macandong. For now, we'll move on to our third speaker. Thank you so much again, Dr. J. Picardal.
Thank you, ma'am.
For those who just joined us, we are also live on Facebook right now. So hello to everyone who's watching us from the comfort of their own homes. We also have our participants here on Facebook, but we've opened up our research session to other people who weren't able to register to our Zoom session para naman yung mga iba rin malalaman din nila kung ano ang mga pinag-aaralan ng iba't iba nating mananaliksik sa Philippines. All right.